Today, we're diving deep into one of the most enduring monsters in human history, the werewolf. We're going to trace this creature from its origins in ancient mythology all the way through to modern Hollywood blockbusters. This is going to be a journey spanning thousands of years, crossing continents, and exploring what it is about the idea of human transformation into beast that has captivated us for so long. So get comfortable, because we're going to be here for a while. This is a deep dive in the truest sense, so let's start at the very beginning. When we think about werewolves today, we often think about full moons, silver bullets, and hairy transformations. But the roots of werewolf mythology go back much, much further than most people realize. We're talking about ancient civilizations, the very foundations of Western literature and mythology. The ancient Greeks had a fascinating relationship with the concept of lycanthropy, which is the term we use for the transformation of human into wolf. The word itself comes from Greek, combining lykos, meaning wolf, and anthropos, meaning human. And one of the earliest stories we have comes from the Greek writer Ovid in his epic work Metamorphoses, written around 8 CE. But even Ovid was recounting a much older legend, one that probably goes back centuries before his time. The story goes like this. There was a king named Lycaon, ruler of Arcadia, a mountainous region in the center of the Peloponnese. Now, Arcadia was known as a wild, rugged place, far from the sophistication of Athens or the military might of Sparta. It was a liminal space, caught between civilization and wilderness, and that's important for understanding this story. Lycaon was apparently not the most pious of rulers. When Zeus, king of the gods, came to visit him disguised as a mortal traveler, Lycaon decided to test whether this visitor was really divine. So what did he do? He served Zeus human flesh. Some versions say it was the flesh of a murdered guest. Others say it was one of Lycaon's own sons. Either way, not exactly the kind of hospitality you want to show the king of the gods. In Greek culture, hospitality was sacred. Guests were under the protection of Zeus himself. To violate that hospitality, especially with such a horrific act, was one of the worst crimes imaginable. Zeus was, understandably, absolutely furious. As punishment for this horrific act of impiety and cannibalism, Zeus transformed Lycaon into a wolf. The transformation was described as fitting because Lycaon had shown himself to be bestial, savage, and lacking in the qualities that separate civilized humans from wild animals. His outer form now matched his inner nature. This is a theme we're going to see again and again throughout werewolf mythology. The transformation into a wolf is often depicted as a revelation of someone's true, savage nature. But there's something else interesting about this story. In Ovid's telling, even after Lycaon becomes a wolf, certain aspects of his former self remain. He still has that same savage look in his eyes, the same ferocity, the same lust for blood. He's not just any wolf, he's Lycaon as a wolf. His identity persists through the transformation. This idea that the person doesn't entirely disappear when they become a wolf, that some essence remains, is crucial to how werewolf mythology develops. The Greeks weren't the only ancient civilization with wolf transformation stories. The Romans inherited and expanded upon Greek mythology, and they had their own spin on these tales. In fact, the founding myth of Rome itself involves wolves. You probably remember the story of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who were abandoned as infants and nursed by a she-wolf. This powerful image of the wolf as both nurturer and savage beast runs throughout Roman culture. The Romans also had festivals and rituals connected to wolves. The Lupercalia was an ancient Roman festival held every February, and it involved priests called Luperci, which might derive from lupus, the Latin word for wolf. These priests would sacrifice goats and a dog, then run around the Palatine Hill, striking people with strips of the sacrificial goat hide, which was supposed to promote fertility. The connection between wolves, wildness, fertility, and transformation was deeply embedded in Roman religious practice. There were also Roman werewolf stories that took on different tones than the Greek tales. Petronius, writing in the 1st century CE, included a werewolf story in his Satyricon. In this tale, a soldier transforms into a wolf at night, and the narrator witnesses the transformation. The soldier removes his clothes, which turn to stone, and then becomes a wolf. This detail about the clothes is interesting because it shows up again and again in later werewolf folklore. The idea is that werewolves need to remove their human clothes to transform, and those clothes must remain untouched for them to transform back. If someone moves or destroys the clothes, the person might be trapped in wolf form. But perhaps most fascinating in the ancient world are references to actual groups of warriors who might have inspired or been inspired by werewolf myths. In Germanic and Norse cultures, there were warriors called berserkers and ulfednar. The berserkers wore bear skins and were said to fight with uncontrollable trance-like fury. The ulfednar wore wolf skins and were similarly fierce. These warriors might have used drugs, worked themselves into ecstatic states, or engaged in ritualistic practices that made them feel like they were becoming animals. The line between warrior cult and werewolf legend gets very blurry here. In Norse mythology, there are several references to shape-shifting and wolf transformations. The Völsunga saga tells of Sigmund and his son Sinfjotli, who find wolf pelts in the forest that transform anyone who wears them into a wolf for 10 days. While in wolf form, they can understand wolf speech and gain the strength and ferocity of wolves. They go on a killing spree, and at one point, Sinfjotli is wounded, and Sigmund, in wolf form, has to find magical herbs to heal him. When the 10 days are up, they burn the cursed wolf skins. This story combines transformation, violence, father-son bonding, and the idea that wolf form brings both power and danger. The Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, our main sources for Norse mythology, also mention Fenrir, the giant wolf who is one of Loki's children. Fenrir is prophesied to kill Odin during Ragnarok, the end of the world. Fenrir isn't a werewolf in the sense of being a human who transforms. But the wolf as a force of chaos and destruction is a powerful theme in Norse culture. Wolves represented the wild forces beyond human control, the darkness and winter that threatened to overwhelm civilization. Now, as we move from the classical world into the medieval period, the werewolf legend starts to take on darker, more sinister tones. This is where we really see the werewolf become a figure of horror rather than just transformation. And a lot of this has to do with the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. In the medieval Christian worldview, the werewolf became associated with demonic possession, witchcraft, and heresy. The wolf itself was often seen as a symbol of the devil. Remember, this is a time when wolves were still a very real threat to European communities. They attacked livestock, they were dangerous to travelers, and in harsh winters, they could even pose a threat to humans, particularly children. So the wolf wasn't just a mythological creature, it was a genuine source of fear in everyday life. Villages would organize wolf hunts, bounties were placed on wolves, and areas where wolves were particularly common were considered dangerous and avoided when possible. Medieval texts are full of werewolf stories, and they're often quite different from what we'd recognize today. For one thing, the transformation wasn't always involuntary. Many medieval werewolf tales involve people who deliberately used magic or witchcraft to transform themselves into wolves. They might wear a wolfskin belt, or use special ointments made from horrible ingredients, or recite incantations. This was seen as a form of black magic, a pact with dark forces. The Christian Church had complicated views on werewolves. On one hand, some theologians argued that physical transformation into animals was impossible because only God could fundamentally alter creation in that way. Therefore, werewolves must be either demonic illusions, mental illness where someone believed they were a wolf, or cases where the devil allowed a demon to animate a wolf's body while keeping the person's soul imprisoned. On the other hand, many people, including some church authorities, did believe in literal physical transformation through satanic power. One of the most famous medieval werewolf stories comes from the 12th century French poet Marie de France. Her lie, or narrative poem, called Bisclavret, tells the story of a nobleman who transforms into a wolf for 3 days every week. His wife, disturbed by this revelation, betrays him by stealing his clothes, which he needs to transform back into human form. Without his clothes, he's trapped in wolf form and lives in the forest. Eventually, the king encounters this wolf while hunting and is amazed by how tame and intelligent it seems. The wolf kisses the king's foot and seems to beg for mercy. The king is so moved by this that he brings the wolf back to court as a curiosity. The wolf lives at court and is perfectly behaved until one day the nobleman's treacherous wife and her new husband visit. The wolf attacks them savagely. The king is puzzled because the wolf has never shown aggression before. Eventually, through investigation, the truth comes out. The nobleman is restored to human form when his clothes are returned to him, and his treacherous wife is punished by having her nose cut off. She and her descendants are said to be born noseless from then on. What's interesting about Bisclavret is that the werewolf isn't really portrayed as evil. He's a victim of betrayal, and even in wolf form, he retains his nobility and reason. He knows how to show deference to the king, he controls his violent impulses, except when faced with those who wronged him, and he's ultimately vindicated and restored. This is actually a common thread in medieval werewolf stories from France and Britain. There's often this idea that a noble person can be trapped in wolf form, but still maintain their essential humanity and virtue. Another famous medieval werewolf story is Guillaume de Palerne, a French romance later translated into English. In this story, a prince is transformed into a werewolf by his stepmother's magic. In wolf form, he rescues and protects a young prince and princess, helping them escape danger and eventually bringing them together. Again, the werewolf is noble and good, a protector rather than a threat. The story ends with the stepmother being forced to reverse her spell, and the werewolf returns to his true form. These courtly romances presented a very different image of the werewolf than the one that was developing in other parts of medieval culture. In folklore and church teachings, werewolves were increasingly associated with evil. They were seen as witches who transformed to attack their neighbors' livestock or children, as people possessed by demons, or as individuals who had made pacts with Satan. Things were quite different in other parts of Europe, particularly in Germanic and Eastern European traditions. Here, werewolves were more consistently portrayed as dangerous, often as people who had made pacts with the devil or were suffering from demonic possession. In Slavic folklore, there were beliefs that particularly evil people, especially sorcerers, would become werewolves after death, rising from their graves to terrorize the living. This connects werewolf beliefs to vampire beliefs, and in some regions, the two legends blur together significantly. In Baltic countries, there were more ambivalent views. Some Lithuanian and Latvian folklore presents werewolves as cursed individuals who might be pitied rather than feared, or even as magical protectors who fought against evil forces. In some stories, werewolves would enter hell to retrieve grain stolen by the devil, ensuring good harvests for their communities. These werewolves were more like shamanic figures, using their transformation for the good of their people. And this leads us into one of the darkest chapters in werewolf history, the werewolf trials. Yes, you heard that right. Just as there were witch trials throughout Europe in the early modern period, there were also werewolf trials. People were accused of being werewolves, put on trial, tortured into confessions, and executed. These trials were particularly common in France and Germany during the 16th and 17th centuries, right at the peak of the witch trial hysteria. The werewolf trials need to be understood in the context of the broader witch hunts that swept Europe during this period. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft between the 15th and 18th centuries. The werewolf trials were part of this same phenomenon, though they were less common and the accused were more often men. The reasoning was that while women were more susceptible to being seduced by the devil into witchcraft, men were more likely to be transformed into beast form. One of the most infamous cases was that of Peter Stump in Germany in 1589. This case was widely publicized through pamphlets and became notorious across Europe. Stump was a farmer from Bedburg near Cologne, and he was accused of being a serial killer who had murdered and eaten 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and various livestock over a period of 25 years. According to the confession extracted under torture, Stump claimed that the devil had given him a magical belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf. He described killing and eating his victims with horrific detail, including claims that he had killed and eaten his own son and had committed incest with his daughter and other female relatives. The pamphlets describing his crimes spared no gruesome detail, describing how he would tear out the throats of his victims, how he would eat their flesh, how he took particular pleasure in killing children. Whether any of this was true is another matter entirely. Like many witch trial victims, Stump was likely tortured until he confessed to whatever his accusers wanted to hear. The torture methods used in these trials were horrific. They included the rack, where the body was stretched until joints dislocated, the strappado, where the victim was hung by their wrists, tied behind their back, thumb screws, leg screws, and various other devices designed to inflict maximum pain. Under such torture, people would confess to anything. Stump was executed in a particularly brutal manner designed to serve as a public spectacle and warning. He was broken on the wheel, a form of execution where the condemned person's limbs were broken with a hammer or iron bar, then woven through the spokes of a large wheel which was raised up on a pole for public display. After this, he was beheaded and his body was burned. A wooden pole was erected with a wolf painted on it and topped with Stump's severed head. This gruesome monument was meant to warn others against practicing witchcraft or making pacts with the devil. The Stump case was far from unique. There are records of dozens of werewolf trials across France, Germany, and other parts of Europe during this period. In 1521, 3 men were burned at the stake in Besançon after confessing under torture to transforming into wolves and killing children. In 1541, a Frenchman was burned alive for supposedly transforming into a wolf and killing a woman. In 1573, a man named Gilles Garnier was executed for werewolf activities in France after allegedly killing and eating several children. One particularly tragic case was that of Jean Grenier in France in 1603. Grenier was a teenage boy, possibly mentally disabled, who claimed to transform into a wolf with the help of a salve given to him by a forest dweller. He confessed to killing and eating several children. However, in this case, the court showed some mercy. Rather than executing Grenier, they determined he was mentally incompetent and sentenced him to life imprisonment in a monastery. He died there 7 years later, still claiming at times that he was a wolf. These trials reveal something important about the werewolf myth. It wasn't just entertainment or folklore. People genuinely believed in werewolves, and this belief could have deadly consequences. The werewolf served as an explanation for serial killings, attacks on livestock, and disappearances. In a world without modern forensics or psychology, without understanding of mental illness or serial killer pathology, lycanthropy provided an answer, however terrifying, for seemingly inexplicable evil. Think about it from the perspective of a 16th century villager. Children are disappearing. Mutilated bodies are being found in the woods. No normal person could do such things. The crimes are too brutal, too animalistic. It must be supernatural. It must be that someone in the community, perhaps someone who seems normal by day, is transforming at night into a wolf and committing these atrocities. Once someone was accused, especially if there was already suspicion or dislike directed at them, torture would extract a confession, and the community could feel safe again, believing the monster had been caught and destroyed. But alongside these dark beliefs, there was also a medical and philosophical debate happening. Was lycanthropy a real physical transformation, or was it a form of madness? Medical texts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe lycanthropy as a type of melancholy or mental illness in which the sufferer believed themselves to be a wolf and acted accordingly. They might howl, attempt to eat raw meat, go on all fours, and even try to attack people. Greek and Roman medical texts had discussed this as well. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, described lycanthropy as a disease marked by pale skin, dry eyes, no tears, a dry tongue, and no saliva. Sufferers would wander at night to cemeteries and live like wolves. This was seen as a form of melancholy, an imbalance of the bodily humors. Renaissance and early modern physicians continued this line of thinking. They described lycanthropy as a mental disorder, where the patient's imagination became so disordered that they truly believed they had become a wolf. Some physicians tried to treat it with purgatives, bloodletting, and other standard medical interventions of the time. Others prescribed rest, good food, and calm surroundings to restore balance to the afflicted person's humors. Whether this clinical lycanthropy was a genuine psychological condition, religious mania, epilepsy, rabies, schizophrenia, or simply the result of various brain disorders or even ergot poisoning, which can cause hallucinations and strange behavior, we can't say for certain. But the medical establishment was beginning to naturalize the werewolf, to seek physical and psychological explanations, rather than supernatural ones. This represented a shift in thinking that would accelerate during the Enlightenment. Now, as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, something interesting happens. The Enlightenment brings rationalism and skepticism to the forefront. Belief in literal werewolves begins to decline among educated classes, though it persisted in rural folklore. Wolves themselves were being driven out of Western Europe through systematic hunting programs. In England, wolves had been extinct since the 16th century. In Scotland, they lasted until the 18th century. France, Germany, and other countries had significantly reduced their wolf populations. As wolves disappeared from the landscape, werewolves began to disappear from serious belief, at least in urban areas. But just as belief in real werewolves was fading, the werewolf was being reborn in literature as a figure of Gothic horror and dark romanticism. The late 18th and especially the 19th century saw an explosion of Gothic literature, and werewolves featured prominently. These stories often used the werewolf as a metaphor for the duality of human nature, the beast within civilized man, the tension between reason and passion, control and wildness. This is the era that really shaped modern werewolf fiction. The Gothic movement in literature was obsessed with the supernatural, with ancient curses, with the past intruding on the present, with dark passions that couldn't be controlled by reason. The werewolf fit perfectly into this aesthetic. Here was a creature that represented everything the Enlightenment tried to deny or suppress: the irrational, the bodily, the animal nature of humans. One particularly influential story was Hugues the Werewolf by Sutherland Menzies, published in 1838. This short story appeared in a collection and told of a medieval baron who becomes a werewolf and terrorizes the countryside. Then there was Wagner the Werewolf by George W. M. Reynolds in 1846, a penny dreadful serial that was hugely popular. Penny dreadfuls were cheap serial publications, the pulp fiction of their day, and they often featured sensational stories of crime, horror, and the supernatural. Wagner the Werewolf is particularly interesting because it's one of the first stories to really develop the werewolf as a tragic figure. Wagner is a young man who makes a Faustian bargain. He's offered youth, wealth, and power in exchange for his soul, and part of the curse is that he periodically transforms into a wolf. The story follows his adventures across Europe and even to the Ottoman Empire, dealing with his terrible curse, falling in love, trying to find redemption. It's melodramatic, over the top, and was wildly popular in its day. These stories established many of the tropes we still see today. The tortured protagonist who becomes a monster against their will. The struggle to control the beast within. The terror of not remembering what you did while transformed. The isolation that comes from carrying such a terrible secret. The search for a cure or for redemption. All of these elements became standard in werewolf fiction during this period. This literary tradition reached new heights with Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886. Now, Jekyll and Hyde isn't technically a werewolf story. There's no wolf transformation involved, but it's absolutely part of the same tradition, the same exploration of human duality, transformation, and the beast within. Jekyll's transformation into the brutal Mr. Hyde through a chemical potion echoes the werewolf's transformation, and it had a huge influence on how we think about transformation stories. Stevenson was exploring the idea that every person contains both good and evil impulses, civilization and savagery, reason and passion. Dr. Jekyll believes he can separate these aspects of himself, isolating his baser instincts into Mr. Hyde. But of course, this goes terribly wrong. Hyde becomes stronger, more dominant, harder to control. Eventually, Jekyll loses the ability to keep Hyde contained. The transformation becomes involuntary, happening without the potion. Hyde begins to take over completely. This is essentially a werewolf story in everything but name. The periodic, uncontrollable transformation. The respectable man by day who becomes a monster. The increasing frequency of transformations as the curse strengthens its hold. The ultimate tragedy of being unable to stop the monster within. Jekyll and Hyde provided a psychological framework for understanding transformation narratives that influenced all subsequent werewolf fiction. Around the same time, there was also The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde in 1891. Again, not a werewolf story, but dealing with similar themes of hidden corruption, the beast beneath the civilized surface, and transformation. Dorian remains beautiful while his portrait ages and shows the corruption of his soul. The hidden picture is like the werewolf's hidden nature. The late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw anthropologists and folklorists seriously collecting and studying werewolf legends from around the world. Scholars like James Frazer, whose massive work The Golden Bough compiled myths and folklore from across cultures, began to see patterns. They discovered that shape-shifting myths weren't unique to Europe at all. Cultures across the globe had their own versions. In Africa, there were legends of people transforming into lions, leopards, and hyenas. In West Africa, there were extensive traditions about leopard men, secret societies of sorcerers who could transform into leopards to kill their enemies or targets. These beliefs were so strong that colonial authorities actually conducted trials and executed people accused of being leopard men well into the 20th century. In South America, there were jaguar transformation myths among indigenous peoples. The jaguar was the apex predator, powerful and fearsome, and shamans were believed to be able to take jaguar form. In some cultures, the jaguar was seen as a spiritual protector or guide. In others, were-jaguars were dangerous sorcerers to be feared. In Asia, there were tigers. In India, China, Indonesia, and other countries with tiger populations, there were stories of people transforming into tigers, or of tigers taking human form. In Japan, there were kitsune, fox spirits that could take human form, and tanuki, raccoon dogs with similar abilities. While not quite the same as werewolves, these transformation myths showed the universality of the concept. In Native American traditions, there were numerous shape-shifting stories. Many tribes had traditions of skinwalkers, witches who could transform into various animals, including wolves, coyotes, bears, or birds, by wearing the skin of that animal. The Navajo-Naldlushi is perhaps the most famous of these. Skinwalkers were considered evil, using their powers to harm others. Even speaking about them was taboo in some communities, as it might draw their attention. The werewolf, it turned out, was just the European version of a universal human myth about transformation into a predatory animal. This realization led to some interesting theories about the origins and meaning of these myths. This brings us to an important question. Why? Why are transformation myths so universal? What is it about the idea of humans becoming animals that resonates so deeply across cultures and throughout history? Scholars have proposed various theories, and it's worth exploring them because they help us understand why werewolves continue to fascinate us today. One theory is that these myths reflect ancient shamanic practices. In many indigenous cultures around the world, shamans were believed to be able to transform into animals or take on animal spirits. This was a source of power and wisdom, a way of transcending human limitations and accessing the spirit world. The shaman might enter a trance through drumming, dancing, fasting, or psychoactive substances, and in this altered state, they would experience themselves as becoming an animal. Mircea Eliade, a historian of religion, wrote extensively about shamanic practices and their connections to animal transformation. He argued that the shaman's animal transformation was a return to a primordial state, a time before humans and animals were separate. By becoming an animal, the shaman gained access to animal wisdom, animal power, and could mediate between the human world and the spirit world. The werewolf might be a distorted, Christianized version of these older pagan shamanic traditions. As Christianity spread through Europe, the old pagan practices were demonized. What had once been a shaman's sacred transformation became a witch's evil spell. The werewolf retained the transformation but lost the spiritual context, becoming instead a curse or a monstrous affliction. There's also archaeological evidence that might support this connection. Cave paintings from the Paleolithic era, tens of thousands of years old, show figures that appear to be part human and part animal. The famous sorcerer figure from the cave of the Trois Frères in France shows a humanoid figure with antlers, animal ears, and other animal characteristics. Whether this represents a shaman in ritual costume, a spirit being, or something else, we can't know for sure. But it suggests that the idea of human-animal hybrids or transformations is very, very old indeed. Another theory is psychological. The werewolf represents our fear of losing control, of the civilized self giving way to primal urges. We all contain the capacity for violence, for selfishness, for cruelty. These impulses are part of our evolutionary inheritance. For millions of years, humans and our ancestors survived through aggression, hunting, competition for resources. Civilization is a very recent development in the span of human history, just a few thousand years depending on how you define it. The werewolf is a literalization of this internal struggle. Under the full moon, the beast emerges, doing things the human self would never do. And when the person transforms back, they often have no memory of their actions, or they're horrified by what they've done. This reflects our anxiety about our own darker impulses. What if we lost control? What if the thin veneer of civilization cracked and the savage beneath was revealed? Sigmund Freud and later psychoanalysts would have a field day with werewolf symbolism. The id, the primal part of the psyche, driven by instinct and desire, breaking free from the control of the ego and superego. The return of the repressed. The beast within that must be kept chained, but constantly threatens to break free. The werewolf transformation is a nightmare of psychological disintegration, the loss of the rational self. Carl Jung might see the werewolf as a shadow figure, representing the dark, unacknowledged aspects of the self. Everyone has a shadow, Jung argued, composed of the qualities we reject or deny in ourselves. The shadow must be integrated, not destroyed, or it will erupt in destructive ways. The werewolf is what happens when the shadow is completely suppressed and then explodes forth in uncontrollable violence. There's also a social dimension to werewolf mythology. Werewolves are often outsiders, living on the margins between human civilization and wild nature. They can't fully belong to either world. They're too dangerous to live safely among humans, but they're not truly animals either, retaining their human consciousness and suffering. This resonates with anyone who has felt like an outsider, anyone who doesn't quite fit into social norms. The werewolf becomes a powerful metaphor for alienation and otherness. Think about how many werewolf stories focus on the protagonist's isolation. They can't tell anyone about their condition. They can't form close relationships because they might hurt the people they love. They're constantly on the move, unable to settle, unable to belong. This speaks to deep human fears about rejection, about being unlovable, about being fundamentally different in a way that makes you dangerous or unacceptable. In some modern interpretations, particularly in LGBTQ readings of werewolf fiction, the werewolf can represent queerness or any kind of difference that must be hidden from mainstream society. The werewolf closet parallels the queer closet. The fear of being discovered, of people seeing your true nature and reacting with fear or violence, resonates with anyone who has had to hide fundamental aspects of themselves. The moment of coming out as a werewolf or being forcibly outed carries similar emotional weight to coming out in any other sense. And then there's the physical, visceral aspect of transformation itself. The descriptions in werewolf stories often focus on the pain and horror of the body changing. Bones breaking and reforming. Skin tearing as hair sprouts through it. The face elongating, the jaw cracking as it restructures itself. Teeth pushing through gums. Hands becoming claws. The whole agonizing process of the human body being forced into an animal shape. This taps into deep body horror, our fear of our own bodies betraying us, becoming something we don't recognize or control. It's related to fears about illness, aging, injury, anything that reminds us that our bodies are vulnerable, changeable, not entirely under our command. The werewolf transformation is like puberty or aging or disease taken to a horrific extreme, the body doing something we don't want it to do and can't stop. There's also often a sexual dimension to werewolf transformations, particularly in modern fiction. The transformation is sometimes portrayed in almost ecstatic terms, despite the pain. There's a kind of dark pleasure in giving in to the beast, in shedding human constraints and morality. This connects to anxieties about sexuality, about desire that feels uncontrollable or dangerous, about the animalistic aspects of sex that civilized people are supposed to suppress or sublimate. Some feminist scholars have explored how werewolf narratives relate to fears about male sexuality and violence. The werewolf as uncontrolled male aggression and sexual predation, the beast that civilization tries to restrain but periodically breaks free. In this reading, werewolf stories are cautionary tales about toxic masculinity, about what happens when male violence is excused as natural or uncontrollable. Alternatively, some feminist and queer readings reclaim the werewolf as a figure of empowerment. The werewolf transforms, becomes powerful, is no longer bound by social rules or physical limitations. Particularly for women or others who are socially constrained, the werewolf transformation can represent breaking free from restrictive gender roles or social expectations. This is an interpretation we see in films like Ginger Snaps, which we'll talk about more later. All of these elements, the shamanic, the psychological, the social, the physical, made the werewolf perfect for the medium that would really cement the creature in popular imagination in the 20th century. And this brings us to Hollywood and the golden age of monster movies. The werewolf had appeared in silent films. There was an 1813 German silent film called The Werewolf, though no copies survive. There was a 1913 film called The Werewolf that told a story of a Navajo woman who transforms into a wolf to take revenge on prospectors who killed her daughter. Prints of this film do survive, making it the oldest surviving werewolf film. Throughout the 20s and 30s, there were scattered werewolf appearances in film, but nothing that really captured the public imagination or established a definitive cinematic werewolf. That changed in 1941 with The Wolfman. Directed by George Wagner and starring Lon Chaney Jr., The Wolfman established so many of the elements we now think of as essential to werewolf mythology that it's hard to overstate its influence. Many elements that people think are ancient folklore are actually inventions of screenwriter Kurt Schoedmak for this film. Let's talk about those inventions because they're important. First, the idea that a werewolf bite transmits lycanthropy, turning the victim into a werewolf. This was borrowed from vampire mythology, specifically from the Dracula films, and wasn't traditional in werewolf folklore. In older stories, lycanthropy came from curses, magic, wearing enchanted items, or sometimes it was hereditary, but not from being bitten. Schoedmak introduced the bite transmission, and it immediately became canonical, appearing in virtually every werewolf story since. Second, the full moon as the trigger for transformation. While the moon had long been associated with madness in a general sense, giving us the word lunacy from luna, meaning moon, the specific idea that werewolves only transform during the full moon was largely a Hollywood creation. Older folklore had werewolves transforming for various reasons, at various times, or even at will. But the full moon trigger was dramatically convenient, creating a regular cycle of danger, and it stuck. Third, the silver bullet as the only way to kill a werewolf. Again, this wasn't from traditional folklore, but became canon through The Wolfman. Silver had long been associated with purity and had been used in folklore against various supernatural creatures, particularly vampires in some traditions. But the specific idea that only silver can kill a werewolf was popularized by this film. It's possible this was influenced by the Lone Ranger's silver bullets, which had become iconic in the 1930s radio show, though the Lone Ranger used silver bullets for symbolic reasons, not to fight monsters. The Wolfman also gave us that famous poem, a piece of pseudo-folklore that gets repeated throughout the film. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. This rhyme, entirely invented by Mac for the film, became more famous than actual traditional werewolf lore. It's been quoted, parodied, and referenced countless times in subsequent werewolf media. It sounds like it should be ancient folklore, which was exactly the point. It gave the film a sense of mythic weight, as if it was drawing on centuries of tradition, when in reality it was creating new tradition. The plot of The Wolfman is straightforward but effective. Larry Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr., returns to his family estate in Wales after many years in America. He's trying to reconnect with his father, the Lord of the Manor, played by Claude Rains. Larry meets a local woman named Gwen, becomes attracted to her, and accompanies her and her friend to a Romani camp where they're going to have their fortunes told. At the camp, a fortune teller named Bella, played by Bela Lugosi himself in what amounts to a cameo, has a breakdown, claiming he sees terrible things in his visions. That night, Bella transforms into a wolf and attacks Gwen's friend. Larry rushes to help and kills the wolf with his silver-handled walking stick, but is bitten in the process. When the body is found the next morning, it's not a wolf, but Bella in human form. Larry begins to experience the curse himself. He transforms into a wolf at night and attacks people. He's tormented by guilt and horror at what he's become. He desperately tries to convince his father and others that he's dangerous, that he needs to be locked up or killed, but they think he's suffering from delusions or guilt-driven madness. The film builds to a tragic climax where Larry, in wolf form, is beaten to death by his own father, who doesn't realize what he's doing until the creature transforms back into Larry's human body. The 1941 Wolfman tapped into anxieties of its time in interesting ways. It was released in December of 1941, right after Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II. Larry Talbot is a man who loses control, who becomes a monster against his will, who kills people he loves. This resonated with audiences facing a world at war, where ordinary people were being forced into horrific violence, where the thin veneer of civilization seemed to be collapsing. Young men were being drafted, sent across oceans to kill and possibly be killed. The idea of becoming something monstrous through circumstances beyond your control had a particular resonance. Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance as Larry Talbot was sympathetic and tragic. He wasn't a villain or even an anti-hero. He was a victim. This marked a shift in how werewolves were portrayed. They became figures of truity rather than pure evil. The real monster wasn't the wolf, it was the curse. The loss of control, the inability to stop yourself from doing terrible things. Larry doesn't want to hurt anyone. He tries to get help, tries to warn people, tries to leave, but nothing works. The curse is stronger than his will, stronger than his morality, stronger than his love for his father or for Gwen. The makeup and special effects in The Wolfman were groundbreaking for their time. Jack Pierce, the legendary makeup artist who had created the iconic looks for Frankenstein's monster, and The Mummy, designed the werewolf makeup. It was achieved through a painstaking process that took hours and hours. Chaney would sit in a chair while Pierce applied yak hair, bit by bit, gluing it to his face and hands. Then they would shoot a few frames of film. Then Chaney would sit still while more hair was applied and the makeup was built up further. Then a few more frames. This process would repeat over and over. When the film was played back at normal speed, it created the illusion of hair growing across his face and body in real time. For 1941, this was cutting-edge stuff, and it terrified audiences. The werewolf makeup itself was less overtly wolf-like than later interpretations would be. Chaney's Wolfman has a fairly human face with heavy brow ridges, elongated canine teeth, pointed ears, and of course all that hair. He walks upright on two legs, more like a hairy man than a wolf. This would become the standard approach for movie werewolves for decades, the Wolfman hybrid rather than a full wolf. The Wolfman was a huge success, and Universal Studios quickly capitalized on it. Chaney reprised the role of Larry Talbot in several sequels throughout the 1940s. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman in 1943, where the Wolfman is revived and teams up with and fights Frankenstein's monster. House of Frankenstein in 1944, which threw in Dracula as well for a monster mash. House of Dracula in 1945 continued the trend. These later films were less sophisticated than the original Wolfman, often descending into B-movie territory, but they kept the werewolf in the public consciousness and cemented Lon Chaney Jr.'s Larry Talbot as the iconic cinematic werewolf. After the golden age of Universal horror ended in the late 1940s, werewolf films went through various phases. The 1950s and 60s saw some low-budget werewolf movies, often with rubber masks or cheap costumes rather than elaborate makeup effects. There was I Was a Teenage Werewolf in 1957, which combined the werewolf legend with teenage rebellion, and was surprisingly successful. The Hammer Film Productions in Britain made Curse of the Werewolf in 1961, starring Oliver Reed, which brought gothic horror sensibility and more graphic violence to the werewolf legend. But nothing in this period really captured the public imagination the way the Wolfman had. Werewolves were present in horror cinema, but they'd become somewhat routine, somewhat predictable. That would change dramatically in 1981, a landmark year for werewolf cinema that saw not one but two films revolutionize the genre and set the standard for all future werewolf movies. 1981 gave us An American Werewolf in London and The Howling, both released within months of each other. It was an incredible coincidence that two major studio films with groundbreaking werewolf effects came out the same year. Both films revolutionized the genre, but in different ways. An American Werewolf in London, directed by John Landis, was a game-changer. It combined genuine horror with pitch-black comedy in a way that hadn't really been done before in werewolf cinema. The story follows two American backpackers, David and Jack, who are hiking across the Yorkshire moors in England. They stop at a pub called The Slaughtered Lamb, where the locals are acting strangely hostile and warn them to stay on the road and beware the moon. The Americans, being Americans, don't take this seriously enough. They leave the pub, get lost on the moors, and are attacked by a large animal. Jack is killed, torn apart, and David is badly wounded before the creature is shot by locals who arrive too late to save Jack. David wakes up in a hospital in London, having been unconscious for 3 weeks. He's told he was attacked by a wild dog or possibly an escaped zoo animal. But David has strange dreams and fragmented memories that suggest something else. And then Jack appears to him, not alive but dead and decomposing. Jack's ghost explains that they were attacked by a werewolf, that David is now cursed to become a werewolf himself, and that David needs to kill himself before the next full moon to prevent the curse from spreading. Jack begs David to commit suicide, explaining that he and all of David's future victims are trapped in limbo, unable to find rest until the werewolf bloodline is ended. David doesn't believe this naturally. He thinks he's going crazy, suffering from trauma and guilt over Jack's death. He starts a relationship with a nurse named Alex, who is taking care of him, and things seem to be getting better. But then the full moon comes, and David transforms. The transformation scene is what made this film legendary. Using groundbreaking practical effects designed and executed by Rick Baker, the audience watches David's transformation in excruciating, extended detail. It doesn't happen in a few quick cuts or behind shadows. It's all there on screen in bright light. His hands stretch and elongate, the bones cracking audibly, the fingers extending into claws. His face pushes outward, the skull restructuring itself, the jaw extending. His spine curves and extends. Hair erupts from his skin. He's screaming in agony the entire time, and you believe it. It looks painful. It looks real in a way that nothing had before. Rick Baker used a combination of techniques. Animatronics for certain movements, prosthetics that could be inflated with air bladders to simulate bones moving under skin, careful makeup transitions, mechanized heads that could change shape. The sequence took several days to film and cost a fortune, but it was worth it. When audiences saw it, they were stunned. This was a level of special effects that had never been achieved before. Rick Baker won the first ever Academy Award for Best Makeup for this work, and it's still considered one of the greatest practical effects sequences ever filmed, even decades later when CGI can do things Baker could only dream of. But An American Werewolf in London wasn't just about the effects. It was about the psychological horror of becoming a monster. David is visited not just by Jack, but eventually by all of his victims as he kills more people during his werewolf nights. They appear to him as progressively more decomposed corpses, all begging him to kill himself. The film explores guilt, loss of control, and the horror of being unable to stop yourself from hurting others. David knows what he's doing is wrong. He's mortified by it. But he can't stop. The curse is stronger than his will. The film also has moments of genuine humor. The conversations between David and the rotting Jack are darkly comic. There's a scene where David, trying to get arrested so he'll be locked up during the full moon, causes a scene in a London zoo, yelling at the wolves that they're making him look bad. The blend of horror and comedy was unusual for the time and showed that werewolf stories didn't have to be uniformly grim. The film builds to a tragic ending. During his final transformation, David is cornered in an alley by police. Alex, the woman he loves, pushes through the police lines and approaches the werewolf, telling David that she loves him. For a moment, the werewolf seems to recognize her, seems to calm. Then the police open fire, killing him. He transforms back into David's human form, dead in the alley, and the film ends abruptly. There's no triumph, no cure found, just tragedy. The other major 1981 werewolf film, The Howling, directed by Joe Dante, took a different approach. This was more of an ensemble piece rather than focusing on a single protagonist. The film follows a television news reporter who has a traumatic encounter with a serial killer. To recover, she and her husband go to a rural retreat called The Colony. Unknown to them, The Colony is actually home to a pack of werewolves who are trying to live peacefully and integrate into human society, though some members of the pack disagree with this approach and want to embrace their predatory nature. The effects in The Howling, done by Rob Bottin with some contributions from Rick Baker before he left the project to work on An American Werewolf in the Woods, London, were also spectacular. The transformation sequences were elaborate and disturbing, with an emphasis on the pain and body horror of the change. There's one famous scene where a character transforms in front of a campfire, and the shadow on the wall shows the full extent of the transformation in silhouette. It's an incredibly effective moment. The Howling emphasized werewolves as a secret society, almost a separate species living hidden among humans. This would become an increasingly common trope in werewolf fiction. The idea that there are werewolves all around us, passing for human, living their lives while hiding their true nature. The film explored conflicts within werewolf society between those who want to suppress their animal natures and coexist peacefully with humans, and those who see themselves as superior predators who shouldn't have to hide. The Howling spawned numerous sequels, 7 in total, though the quality dropped off dramatically after the first one. Most of the sequels were low budget and increasingly silly, but the original remains a cult classic, and along with An American Werewolf in London, demonstrated that there was still plenty of terror and fascination to be mined from the lycanthropy legend. These 2 films revitalized werewolf cinema and proved audiences' appetite for the creature. They also set a new standard for transformation effects. After 1981, audiences expected werewolf transformations to be elaborate, painful-looking set pieces, major moments in the film showcasing the special effects artists' skills. The quick dissolves or man-in-a-suit approaches of earlier eras were no longer acceptable. If you were going to make a werewolf movie, you needed to deliver on the transformation. The 1980s and 90s saw a steady stream of werewolf films, some good, many forgettable. We got Teen Wolf in 1985, a comedy starring Michael J. Fox as a high school student who discovers he's a werewolf and uses his abilities to become popular and win basketball games. This lighter take showed the versatility of the werewolf myth. Lycanthropy didn't have to be a curse. It could be cool, it could be fun, it could be empowering. Teen Wolf spawned a sequel and an animated series and proved that werewolves could work in family-friendly contexts. Silver Bullet in 1985, based on Stephen King's novella Cycle of the Werewolf, brought the werewolf to small-town America. This film emphasized the mystery aspect, with characters trying to figure out which member of their community is the werewolf. It's a whodunit with a monster, and it worked reasonably well, with a particularly memorable final confrontation in a church. The Company of Wolves in 1984, directed by Neil Jordan, took a completely different approach. This art house film used werewolf mythology to explore themes from Little Red Riding Hood and other fairy tales, with heavy symbolism around female sexuality, danger, and transformation. It's a fever dream of a film, nested dreams within dreams, with werewolves representing predatory male sexuality and the dangers young women face as they mature. The transformations are surreal and disturbing, with one particularly famous scene where a man's face splits open and a wolf emerges from inside. Wolf in 1994, starring Jack Nicholson and directed by Mike Nichols, brought a sophisticated corporate setting to lycanthropy. Nicholson plays a publishing executive who is bitten by a wolf and begins to transform. As he becomes more wolf-like, he also becomes more confident, more aggressive, and more successful in the cutthroat world of corporate publishing. The film explores the werewolf as a metaphor for business culture, for survival of the fittest, for unleashing your predatory instincts to get ahead. It's an interesting take, though the film itself is a mixed bag. But as we moved into the 2000s, something interesting happened. The werewolf began to be reimagined yet again, this time in the context of urban fantasy and paranormal romance. Werewolves started appearing less as singular cursed individuals and more as entire societies, species, or subcultures existing alongside humanity. The Underworld series, starting in 2003, featured werewolves called lycans in the films, in an eternal war with vampires. These weren't your shambling hairy monsters from old horror films. These were sleek, powerful creatures that could shift between human and wolf-like forms. The design of the lycans was very different from traditional werewolves. They were larger, more monstrous, almost reptilian in some of their features, with elongated skulls and digitigrade legs. They were presented as almost a separate evolutionary branch, with their own society, politics, and culture. The Underworld films borrowed heavily from Gothic aesthetic and action cinema, creating a stylish, effects-heavy spectacle. The lycans were presented sympathetically, having been enslaved by vampires in the backstory, fighting for their freedom and survival. The war between vampires and lycans was portrayed as morally complex, with atrocities on both sides. This was werewolves as action heroes, as warriors, as tragic figures fighting for their people's survival. But the real game changer in terms of popular culture was the Twilight series. Now, before you groan or roll your eyes, hear me out. Whether you love or hate Twilight, and there are passionate advocates on both sides, there's no denying it had a massive impact on how werewolves were portrayed in popular media. The books by Stephanie Meyer became publishing phenomena, and the film adaptations were box office hits. The werewolves in Twilight, technically they're shapeshifters descended from an ancient Native American magical bloodline rather than cursed individuals, were presented very differently from traditional werewolf lore. They could transform at will, not just during the full moon. They had complete control in wolf form, retaining their human consciousness. They were protectors of their community, defending humans from vampires. And crucially, they were romantic figures, particularly the character of Jacob Black. Jacob becomes the third point in a love triangle with Bella, the human protagonist, and Edward, the vampire. The werewolf as love interest was not entirely new. There had been paranormal romance novels featuring werewolves for years, but Twilight brought it to a massive mainstream audience. Jacob was passionate, warm, protective, dangerous, but in an exciting rather than terrifying way. He represented an alternative to the cold, controlled vampire Edward. Where Edward was all about restraint and danger barely contained, Jacob was about heat and passion and letting go. This sparked a whole wave of paranormal romance novels and films featuring werewolves as love interests. The werewolf went from being purely a monster to being a potential boyfriend, albeit a complicated one with anger management issues and a tendency to transform when emotional. This was actually a return, in some ways, to older traditions. Remember those medieval stories where werewolves could be noble and sympathetic? This was tapping into that with a heavy dose of modern romance tropes added in. The success of Twilight proved there was a huge audience for supernatural romance, and werewolves featured prominently in the boom that followed. Bookstores created entire sections for paranormal romance and urban fantasy, much of it featuring werewolves, vampires, and other supernatural beings in contemporary settings, often with romantic relationships at the center of the plot. The 2000s and 2010s also saw werewolves become prominent in television in unprecedented ways. True Blood, which ran from 2008 to 2014, featured werewolves as part of its supernatural ensemble. In this show, werewolves were organized into packs with strict hierarchies, and lycanthropy was hereditary. The show explored werewolf pack dynamics, politics, and conflicts, treating werewolves as a distinct community within the show's universe. Teen Wolf, a reboot and reimagining of the 1980s film, ran for 6 seasons from 2011 to 2017. This show went deep into werewolf mythology, creating an elaborate system of different types of werewolves, true alphas, betas, omegas, each with different abilities and roles. The show focused on high school students dealing with lycanthropy as a metaphor for adolescence, identity, and belonging. It was about finding your pack, about controlling your transformations, about becoming who you're meant to be. Other shows featured werewolves prominently as well. Grimm had various types of werewolf-like creatures called Blutbaden. The Originals, a spin-off of The Vampire Diaries, featured werewolves cursed to transform painfully every full moon unless they wore magical rings. Bitten, based on the novels by Kelly Armstrong, focused on the only female werewolf in a male-dominated pack, exploring gender dynamics within werewolf society. Being Human, both the British original and the American remake, featured a werewolf as one of its 3 main characters, a ghost, a vampire, and a werewolf sharing a house and trying to live normal lives. All of these shows explored werewolves in ongoing narrative forms, allowing for much deeper exploration of what it means to be a werewolf, how werewolf society functions, how lycanthropy affects relationships and identity, than a 2-hour film could manage. Television became the ideal medium for werewolf stories in some ways, allowing characters to live with their condition over years of story time, dealing with the regular cycles of transformation, the political dynamics of pack life, the challenges of hiding their nature from normal humans. This brings us more or less to the present day, 2025. Recent werewolf films and shows have continued to explore different angles on the mythology and push boundaries in new directions. What We Do in the Shadows, both the original film and the ongoing television series, included werewolves as comedic foils to the vampire protagonists, playing up pack mentality and territoriality for laughs. The werewolves in What We Do in the Shadows are trying to be civilized despite their transformations. They have pack meetings with printed agendas. They swear not to swear, then immediately swear and have to apologize to the pack. They deal with internal pack politics and conflicts over who gets to be pack leader. It's a hilarious deconstruction of werewolf tropes, taking all the serious elements of pack dynamics, transformation cycles, and werewolf-vampire rivalry and playing them for comedy. On the horror side, films like Dog Soldiers and Ginger Snaps offered fresh takes. Dog Soldiers, a British film from 2002, was an action horror hybrid about a squad of soldiers on training exercises in the Scottish Highlands who encounter werewolves. It played more like a siege film or a war movie than a traditional werewolf horror film, with military tactics and camaraderie in the face of monster attacks. Ginger Snaps, a Canadian film from 2000, was particularly interesting. It used lycanthropy as a metaphor for female puberty, with the werewolf transformation paralleling the bodily and emotional changes of adolescence. The film follows two teenage sisters, Ginger and Brigitte, who are morbidly fascinated with death. Ginger is bitten by a creature on the same night she gets her first period, and her transformation into a werewolf mirrors the changes of puberty taken to a horrific extreme. She becomes aggressive, sexually active, grows hair in unexpected places, experiences intense mood swings, and becomes dangerous to those around her. The film explores the terror and confusion of bodily changes you can't control, of becoming someone you don't recognize, of your body seemingly betraying you. It also explores the bond between the sisters, with Brigitte desperately trying to find a cure, or at least help Ginger control the transformation. Ginger Snaps is a smart, subversive film that asks what it means when the monster is specifically female, when the loss of control and the body horror map onto anxieties about female sexuality and power rather than male aggression. Ginger Snaps spawned two sequels, Ginger Snaps Unleashed and Ginger Snaps Back, the prequel, and has become a cult classic. It demonstrated that werewolf mythology could be used to explore specifically female experiences and concerns in ways that much of werewolf fiction, which has traditionally centered male protagonists, had not. There have also been interesting international takes on werewolf mythology. When Animals Dream, a Danish film from 2014, offered a slow-burn, atmospheric approach to a young woman discovering she's a werewolf. Wildling from 2018 explored similar themes of female coming-of-age and transformation. These films tend to be more art house in approach, less focused on jump scares or elaborate action sequences, more interested in mood, atmosphere, and metaphor. Late Phases, a 2014 film, gave us an elderly blind veteran as the werewolf hunter protagonist, which was a refreshing change from the usual young heroes. The film is about aging, about being dismissed by society, about proving you still have value and capability. The werewolf threat becomes an opportunity for the protagonist to demonstrate that he's not ready to be put out to pasture, so to speak. Video games have also embraced werewolves in significant ways. The Elder Scrolls series, particularly Skyrim, features playable werewolf characters with an entire skill tree dedicated to werewolf abilities. Players can transform at will, gain enhanced strength and speed, and terrorize NPCs, but also face the drawback that they can't get rest bonuses while infected with lycanthropy. World of Warcraft has had Worgen, wolf-like humanoids, as a playable race. The transformation between human and Worgen forms is a key part of their identity. The Witcher series, both the games and the Netflix show, includes werewolves in its extensive monster catalog. These werewolves can sometimes be reasoned with, sometimes not, depending on whether they're cursed individuals who retain their humanity or creatures that have fully given in to their bestial nature. The Witcher's approach to monsters in general is to ask whether they can be saved or must be killed, and this applies to werewolves as well. Werewolf. The Apocalypse is an entire tabletop role-playing game system built around werewolf mythology. In this game, werewolves, called Garou, are eco-warriors fighting against the worm, a cosmic force of corruption and destruction that is manifesting through environmental destruction, corporate greed, and spiritual decay. The Garou see themselves as Gaia's warriors, defending the natural world against human industrial civilization. It's a fascinating inversion of traditional werewolf stories, where the werewolves are the heroes and human civilization is the threat. So where does the werewolf stand now in 2025? The werewolf remains a flexible, powerful metaphor that can be adapted to different genres and purposes. It can be pure horror, exploring body horror, loss of control, and predatory violence. It can be action-adventure, with werewolves as powerful warriors or hunters. It can be romance, with the werewolf as a dangerous but alluring lover. It can be comedy, playing with the absurdity of the transformation and the tropes that have built up around it. It can be drama, exploring identity, belonging, and what it means to be different. What's interesting is how the werewolf has evolved alongside our changing anxieties and interests. In ancient times, it represented the thin line between civilization and barbarism, divine punishment for transgressing sacred laws. In medieval times, it became associated with heresy, witchcraft, and demonic influence. In the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, it became a metaphor for madness, for the limits of human knowledge and control. In the Industrial Age and the Victorian era, it represented the beast within the civilized man, the return of the repressed, the animal nature that civilization tries to suppress. In the 20th century, it explored duality, the monster within, and the horror of uncontrollable violence. In modern times, it's been used to explore identity, belonging, adolescence, sexuality, gender, otherness, environmental destruction, pack dynamics, and more. The werewolf is infinitely adaptable because, at its core, it's about transformation, and transformation is one of the most fundamental human experiences. We all go through changes that feel like we're becoming different people. Puberty, aging, trauma, love, loss. All of these transform us in ways that can feel as dramatic and uncontrollable as any werewolf curse. We all have aspects of ourselves that we fear or try to keep hidden from others. We all worry about losing control, about our bodies betraying us, about not recognizing ourselves, about hurting the people we love. And there's something primal about the wolf itself that continues to fascinate us. Wolves have been living alongside humans for thousands of years, first as competitors for prey and territory, then as companions when we domesticated them into dogs. We have a complicated relationship with wolves, admiring their pack loyalty, their hunting prowess, their intelligence and adaptability, while also fearing their wildness, their predatory nature, their place as apex predators. The wolf represents both freedom and danger, both community and savagery, both loyalty and violence. In many ways, the werewolf is the perfect monster for our times. It's not purely evil, it's not purely other. The werewolf is us, or at least it could be. That's what makes it frightening and fascinating. Unlike vampires, who are undead and must feed on humans to survive, who are fundamentally different from living humans or zombies, who are mindless corpses, werewolves are living people who periodically lose control. The werewolf could be your neighbor, your friend, your family member, or yourself. This brings us to some of the persistent questions that werewolf fiction continues to grapple with. Can a werewolf control their transformation? Are they responsible for what they do in wolf form? Is lycanthropy a curse, or could it be seen as a gift? Can werewolves coexist with normal humans, or are they doomed to be hunted, feared, and killed? Different stories answer these questions differently, and that's part of what keeps the mythology fresh. In some versions, werewolves have no control and no memory of their actions. They're pure victims of their curse, horrified by what they've done, but unable to prevent it. In others, they can learn to control the transformation, retaining their human mind even in wolf form, choosing when and if to change. Some stories present lycanthropy as purely horrible, something to be cured or ended at any cost. Others present it as a kind of superpower, offering enhanced strength, senses, healing abilities, and connection to nature that makes it worth the complications. The question of responsibility is particularly interesting from a legal and moral standpoint. If you commit murder while transformed, with no control over your actions and possibly no memory of them, are you guilty? Should you be punished? Are you a danger that needs to be eliminated, or a victim who needs help? Some stories explore this, having werewolves live in constant guilt and fear, choosing isolation and self-imposed exile to protect others. Others have werewolves simply not care, embracing their predatory nature, seeing humans as prey. Still others explore attempts to find legal and social frameworks that account for lycanthropy, treating it as a condition that requires management rather than a crime that requires punishment. The question of coexistence is also fascinating. Can werewolves live peacefully in human society? Many modern stories say yes, presenting werewolves as a kind of minority group managing a condition, hiding in plain sight like any closeted individual, forming their own communities and support networks. This can be read as a metaphor for any number of real-world experiences of being different, of having to hide aspects of yourself to stay safe, of finding your people who understand what you're going through. And then there's the question of the pack. Wolf packs have a strong social hierarchy, though the reality of wolf pack dynamics is more complex than the simple alpha, beta, omega hierarchy that popular culture has latched onto. Real wolf packs are usually family groups with parents, offspring, and sometimes unrelated individuals who've joined. The parents are the leaders not because they're the strongest or most dominant, but because they're the parents, the experienced adults. But in werewolf fiction, pack dynamics have taken on a life of their own. The alpha as the strongest leader who must be challenged and defeated to be replaced. Betas as enforcers or lieutenants. Omegas as the lowest ranking members. Complex rules about loyalty, about following pack law, about what happens when you go rogue or leave the pack. Mate bonds and pack bonds that are described in almost magical terms. Territorial conflicts between packs. All of this has been particularly prominent in paranormal romance and urban fantasy, where werewolf packs function almost like found families or alternative societies with their own rules and cultures. The pack offers belonging and structure, protection and identity, but also restriction, hierarchy, and potential abuse of power. It's family and prison at once, offering both the benefits and the problems that come with tight-knit, hierarchical communities. Looking at all of this, tracing the long journey from King Lycaon to Larry Talbot to Jacob Black to countless other werewolves in books, films, TV shows, games, and other media, it's clear that the werewolf has come a long way. What started as a divine punishment for the worst transgression imaginable has become a rich, complex mythology that continues to evolve and remains relevant. So what's next for werewolves? What new directions will the mythology take? It's hard to predict with certainty, but there are a few trends we can identify that will likely continue or accelerate. There's been a move toward more diverse representation in werewolf fiction. We're seeing werewolf stories centered on women, on people of color, on queer characters, on characters from cultural backgrounds outside the European tradition that has dominated werewolf fiction. This makes sense, given that the werewolf is so often about identity and otherness, about hiding parts of yourself, about transformation and becoming. There's fertile ground for exploring how lycanthropy might intersect with other aspects of identity and experience. Native American and other indigenous creators are reclaiming and reinterpreting skinwalker and shapeshifter traditions in their own voices, pushing back against appropriation and misrepresentation. These stories often have very different tones and meanings than European werewolf tales, connecting shapeshifting to spirituality, to relationships with the land, to cultural identity and resistance. There's also been a trend toward more scientifically grounded or pseudo-scientific explanations for lycanthropy. Some modern stories present it as a virus that spreads through bites or scratches, almost like rabies. Others present it as a genetic condition, something you're born with that activates under certain conditions. Still others present it as induced mutation, perhaps the result of military or corporate experiments. This strips away the supernatural element, but can make the threat feel more immediate and real, more grounded in the modern world. When lycanthropy is a disease, it can spread in epidemics. It can be studied by scientists. It might be cured or treated or, at least, managed with medication. This opens up different storytelling possibilities, particularly in science fiction, medical thriller, or apocalyptic genres. Environmental themes are also becoming more prominent in werewolf fiction. The idea of werewolves as protectors of nature, as beings caught between the human world and the wild, resonates in an age of climate crisis and habitat destruction. The werewolf becomes a symbol of what we're losing, of the wild spaces and wild spirits being driven out by human expansion and exploitation. In some stories, werewolves are explicitly fighting back against environmental destruction, seeing themselves as warriors for the natural world against human civilization's excesses. There's also been interesting work done with historical werewolf fiction, placing werewolves in different time periods and exploring how they would interact with historical events. What would a werewolf have experienced during the World Wars? How would werewolves have been affected by colonialism, both as colonizers and colonized? What role might werewolves have played during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution? These stories can use the werewolf lens to examine history from a different angle, to explore how the marginalized and the monstrous navigate periods of great change and conflict. As special effects technology continues to advance, we're seeing more ambitious and realistic werewolf transformations in film and television. Computer-generated imagery has allowed for transformations that would have been impossible with practical effects. Werewolves can now be shown fully transforming into actual wolves rather than wolf-man hybrids. The transformation can happen faster, more dynamically. Werewolves in wolf form can be larger, more monstrous, more physically impossible than real wolves. However, there's also been a counter-movement that appreciates practical effects. Many filmmakers and audiences feel that practical effects, real makeup and animatronics and prosthetics, have a tactile reality that CGI lacks. When you see Rick Baker's work in An American Werewolf in London, you're watching something that really happened in front of the camera. The actor is really wearing that makeup. Those prosthetics are really there. There's a weight and a reality to it. CGI, no matter how advanced, can sometimes feel floaty or video game-like, so we're seeing some modern productions going back to practical effects, or using a hybrid approach that combines the best of both techniques. The rise of streaming platforms has also been good for werewolf content. With more platforms hungry for content, with algorithms that can connect niche content to niche audiences, there's room for werewolf stories that might not have been greenlit in the traditional studio system. We're seeing more experimental, weird, and diverse werewolf stories as a result. Small indie films that would never have gotten theatrical distribution can find audiences on streaming platforms. Shows that are too strange or specific for network television can thrive on streaming services that don't need to appeal to the broadest possible audience. We're also seeing werewolves show up in unexpected places and genres. There have been werewolf westerns, werewolf mysteries, werewolf rom-coms, werewolf coming-of-age dramas. The werewolf is being combined with other genres and tropes in creative ways. Werewolf cops, werewolf lawyers, werewolf detectives, werewolf soldiers. The possibilities are endless because the werewolf is ultimately just a story device, a way of exploring transformation, duality, and the beast within, and that can be applied to any setting or genre. One thing that's clear is that werewolves aren't going anywhere. They've been with us for thousands of years. From ancient Greek mythology to medieval folklore, to Victorian literature, to Hollywood cinema, to modern streaming series. They'll likely be with us for thousands more, in whatever forms our storytelling takes. Because at the end of the day, the werewolf taps into something fundamental in the human psyche, something that transcends any particular culture or time period. We are animals who became something more, or at least something different. We built civilizations, created art and music and philosophy, developed language and mathematics and science, reached for the stars. But we're still animals underneath it all. We still have instincts, drives, capacities for violence and passion that we don't always understand or control. We're still driven by hunger, by fear, by desire. We still have fight or flight responses, territorial instincts, pack bonding behaviors. The werewolf is a reminder of that duality, of the animal that we were and in some ways still are beneath the veneer of civilization. It's also a reminder that transformation is possible, for good or ill. We can become monsters. We can also transcend our limitations. The curse and the gift are sometimes the same thing. Power and danger go hand in hand. Every full moon brings both terror and wonder. The werewolf embodies the paradox of transformation, that change is both necessary and dangerous, both exciting and terrifying, both loss and gain. In the end, maybe that's why we keep coming back to werewolf stories. They let us explore these tensions in a safe, fantastical context. They let us confront our fears about losing control, about violence, about the beast within. They also let us fantasize about breaking free from constraints, about having power, about embracing our wilder nature, about transformation and becoming something different, something more. The werewolf is horror and freedom, curse and gift, monster and victim, human and animal, civilized and wild. It's one of our oldest stories, and one that continues to feel urgently relevant. From King Lycaon to Larry Talbot to Jacob Black and beyond, through every iteration and interpretation, the werewolf howls through our collective imagination, a reminder of where we came from and what we might become. As we've traced this journey from ancient Greece to Hollywood, from medieval trials to modern television, from serious horror to paranormal romance, from Gothic literature to video games, what emerges is a picture of a myth that refuses to die because it can't die. It's too central to how we think about ourselves, too flexible to be exhausted, too powerful to be forgotten. Every culture that has encountered predatory animals has created transformation myths around them. Every generation has found new meanings in these legends. And as long as we're grappling with questions of identity, control, duality, and what it means to be human, the werewolf will be there lurking in the shadows, waiting for the full moon, ready to transform and remind us that we're never quite as civilized, never quite as in control, never quite as separate from the natural world as we think we are. The werewolf endures because it speaks to truths about the human condition that never change. We are creatures capable of both nobility and savagery. We are forever caught between our higher aspirations and our baser instincts. We are social beings who need community and belonging, but we're also individuals who sometimes feel trapped by social expectations and rules. We are rational creatures who pride ourselves on logic and reason, but we're also driven by emotions and desires that we don't fully understand or control. The werewolf gives form to these contradictions. It makes them visible, literal, dramatic. When the full moon rises and the transformation begins, we're watching an external representation of internal struggles that every person faces. How do we control our tempers, our urges, our darker impulses? What happens when we lose that control? How do we balance our need for wildness and freedom with our need for civilization and order? How do we accept the parts of ourselves that frighten us? How do we integrate our shadows rather than being destroyed by them? These are not questions with easy answers, which is perhaps why we keep telling werewolf stories. Each generation, each storyteller, each new interpretation tries to answer these questions in their own way, reflecting the concerns and anxieties of their particular time and place. But the questions themselves remain constant because they're fundamental to the human experience. The next time you watch a werewolf film, or read a werewolf novel, or play a game with werewolf characters, or see werewolves in any medium, think about that long history we've explored today. Think about all the anxieties and fascinations and questions that have been poured into this one mythological figure over thousands of years. The werewolf you're encountering is the inheritor of all of that, the latest iteration in a story that began around ancient campfires and continues in our modern media landscape. Think about the Greek and Roman myths, about divine punishment and the thin line between human and beast. Think about the medieval tales, about curses and betrayals and nobility trapped in monstrous form. Think about the werewolf trials, about the horrific consequences of belief in monsters. Think about the Gothic literature, about transformation as metaphor for human duality. Think about the golden age of Hollywood horror, about Larry Talbot's tragic curse. Think about the revolution of 1981, about transformation as visceral body horror. Think about modern interpretations, about werewolves as metaphors for identity, sexuality, adolescence, otherness. All of that history, all of those meanings are present in every werewolf story, whether explicitly acknowledged or not. The werewolf carries its history with it, layer upon layer of meaning accumulated over millennia. And maybe, just maybe, when the moon is full and bright and you hear something howling in the distance, you'll feel a little shiver, a little connection to all those people throughout history who heard the same sound and wondered if monsters might be real, wondered if transformation might be possible, wondered if the line between human and beast, between civilization and wilderness, between control and chaos might be thinner than we'd like to believe. That's the power of the werewolf myth. It doesn't matter if we believe in literal shapeshifters anymore. Most of us don't. Most of us understand that the werewolf is fiction, fantasy, metaphor. But the metaphor is strong enough to survive on its own, powerful enough to continue resonating across cultures and generations. We are all, in our own ways, werewolves. We all have transformations we go through, changes that feel as dramatic and uncontrollable as any supernatural curse. We all have aspects of ourselves we hide from the world, parts of our nature we fear or don't fully understand. We all have moments when we don't recognize who we've become, when we look in the mirror and see a stranger. We all live in that liminal space between civilization and wildness, between control and letting go, between our human aspirations and our animal inheritance. The werewolf is us, and that's why the story will never end. As long as humans tell stories, werewolves will be howling in those stories, reminding us of the beasts we were, the beasts we still are, and the beasts we might become. Reminding us that transformation is inevitable, that change is constant, that we contain multitudes, that we're capable of both beauty and horror. Reminding us that the full moon will always rise again, bringing with it the possibility of transformation, for better or for worse. The werewolf has survived for thousands of years, and will survive for thousands more, because it speaks to something eternal in the human experience. It will continue to evolve, to be reinterpreted, to take on new meanings and relevance for new generations. But at its core, it will always be about the same fundamental questions. What does it mean to be human? What separates us from animals? How much control do we really have over ourselves? What happens when we lose that control? Can we accept and integrate all aspects of ourselves, even the frightening ones? Can we find belonging despite our differences? Can transformation be survived, even embraced? These are the questions the werewolf asks, and they're questions worth asking. They're questions we'll be asking as long as humanity exists. And so the werewolf will exist too, in whatever forms our storytelling takes, in whatever media we develop, on whatever planets we might someday inhabit. The werewolf is portable, adaptable, eternal. It's one of our most perfect myths because it's about us. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through werewolf mythology and history. It's been a wild ride, pun very much intended, and I hope you've gained a new appreciation for just how deep and complex the werewolf legend really is. From ancient curses to Hollywood glamour, from genuine trials and executions to romantic fantasies, from body horror to coming-of-age metaphor, the werewolf has been many things to many people, and it continues to evolve with each new generation of storytellers. We've covered thousands of years of history, crossed continents, explored different media and interpretations, examined the werewolf from historical, psychological, social, and artistic perspectives. We've seen how the werewolf reflects the concerns and anxieties of each age, how it's been used to explore everything from divine justice, to mental illness, to sexuality, to environmental destruction. We've traced its journey from mythology to folklore to literature to cinema to television to games and beyond. And through it all, the werewolf endures, transforms, evolves, but never dies. Because the werewolf is more than just a monster. It's a mirror we hold up to ourselves, showing us the animal that still lurks beneath our civilized surface, the wild that we've tried to suppress but can never fully eliminate. It's a reminder that we're creatures of duality, forever caught between opposing forces, forever transforming, forever becoming. The werewolf teaches us that transformation is inevitable, that change is the only constant, that we're always in the process of becoming something new. It teaches us that we contain multitudes, that we're capable of both great good and terrible evil, that we must learn to live with and integrate all aspects of ourselves. It teaches us that community and belonging are essential, but also that there's power in embracing your wild, different nature. It teaches us that curses can be gifts, that gifts can be curses, that power and danger are inseparable. So until next time, keep your doors locked when the moon is full, watch for wolves in the shadows, and remember that the monster you fear most might just be looking back at you from the mirror. But also remember that the beast within isn't always something to fear. Sometimes it's something to understand, to accept, to integrate. Sometimes the wolf is not the enemy, but the key to becoming fully yourself. Stay curious, stay open to transformation, embrace your wild side while maintaining your humanity. And remember that we're all werewolves in our own way, all creatures of duality, all living on that border between civilization and wilderness, control and chaos, human and animal.